Hello again and welcome to another episode of Vintage Pens for Modern Users. I'm glad you've joined me. At the beginning of this series, I did a primer and I mentioned 4 pens essentially that someone who was interested in opening the door of vintage pens as everyday users in this modern world might want to explore. I mentioned in that video the Estabrook J pen, the Parker 45, the Parker 51, and the Waterman 52. I did a few videos exploring those 4 pens individually. Now I'm going to continue this series and explore some other pens that would also make suitable examples as vintage pens that are easy to use, fun to use, have a great deal of variety, and should not be overlooked by someone who wants to use a vintage pen every day. Again, vintage pens were made to be used every day. They were quite durable and quite reliable, and they had to stand a longevity of everyday use for years and years. In fact, lifetime warranties were common in the early advent of the pens because people would make a large expense on a vintage pen and expect it to be used over and over again and last their lifetime. So today we're going to look at one of those pens that came out with such a guarantee. It is the Sheaffer's Balance fountain pen. Sheaffer's Balance was first produced in 1929 and ran all the way until 1942. There were several iterations of the pen in different sizes. And during the 30s, we can say for fountain pens that when it came to color and choice, the use of celluloid in vintage pens took off and really opened up the door for users to go beyond some basic colors. Early in the history of the fountain pen as a writing instrument, we had black hard rubber, red hard rubber, a mix of the two known as mottled hard rubber, mixed hard rubber, or ripple hard rubber. Some even made rose grain patterns. So the best thing you could do to ornament those pens in reality were various bands that would go either on the cap or the barrel or both. You could potentially have overlays. The chasing on the hard rubber could be varied and add some elegance to it. And of course, the most decadent overlays in solid gold that were hand engraved would certainly make the pen such a prize to own, and is often why they were sold in jeweler stores. However, let's get back to celluloid. In the 30s, celluloid became the option that was prominently used by fountain pen makers in the United States and abroad, and the diversity of colors was exceptional, and they still remain quite beautiful pens. Sheaffer's came out with the Balance in 1929. As I said, it was the first pen to take on a really truly streamlined shape. It's sort of a cigar-shaped pen. It fit well, comfortable in the hand, and really put Sheaffer on the map, probably as one of their most prominent pens and most identifiable pens of the company. So we'll take a closer look at the Sheaffer's Balance, and hopefully at the end of this video, you'll want one for your own everyday use in a modern collection, but it's a vintage pen. So here we have it. Quite a lovely pen, as you can see, streamlined in its shape. It's been tapered off nicely at the barrel end and the cap end. You can see people call these cigar-shaped pens for that reason. And the Sheaffer's Balance was really the first to use this design. Now, I spent a lot of time in my introduction talking about beautiful celluloid options. And here I have presented for you a black celluloid pen. And you may be wondering, why? Well, in black, you can appreciate the simplicity of a pen. You won't be distracted by all the other elements that beautiful celluloid might present. So I thought I would start off so that you could just get a sense of the basic shape of the Sheaffer's Balance. And very elegant pen, as you can see here. I mean, I would say this is modern by any standard, even though this was now approaching close to 100 years old, not quite yet, but we're getting there. Posts nicely, comfortable in the hand. We'll talk a little bit about the nibs. This pen has a number 3 nib. You can see that there. Sheaffer's did offer their pens with a variety of nibs, notably this basic nib here. I'll talk about the nib that was considered an upgrade from this, which was the Feather Touch nib that they came out with, as well as the Lifetime nib. As I mentioned earlier, lifetime guarantees became common. I don't know if Sheaffer's was the first. They may well have been to offer a lifetime guarantee. It was on the nib to last the user's lifetime. So very, very high quality pens, and the nibs as well, high quality. So as I mentioned, there were several sizes offered to these pens and a little bit of nuance that you can learn about. So I'm going to pull down in front of me an earlier pen, also black, again, keeping things simple here. If you notice in these two pens, the pen on the left here has a white dot. Now that was Sheaffer's mark on the cap of the pen to denote that it did have a lifetime warranty and would have a lifetime nib. A couple other things before I take off the cap and show the nib of the pen. Notice the clips on these. So Sheaffer went through a little bit of design changes from 1929 through 1942. You can see here on the pin in the left, the lifetime pin, it's a quite long clip, and there's a very prominent ball end to the clip. It's also got a bend to the clip, and Sheaffer's name is imprinted right there on the clip. I'll see if I can get it a little closer for you. So that was something that eventually, as they continued to further streamline the pen, they removed the name, they flattened the ball out on the end, and the clip did get shortened just slightly. We'll talk about sizes. Sheaffer offered the pens in 5 different sizes, from the very smallest, which I have an example of here, you can see, known as the petite. Notably, you can see it's quite tiny. There, I have rather large hands. It is a very diminutive pen, but not diminutive in quality or any other way. It is a lifetime, as you can see here. It would post and could be used, but probably best suited for smaller hands. Again, this was also done for convenience of carry. This might have been a pen that would have again been in a vest pocket. That era hadn't quite disappeared by the 30s, although it was phasing out. And or for women to use if they wanted to tuck a pen in their purse, or even in a little clasp or pocketbook, something like this. A pen of this size would certainly fit that bill. While I've got it in front of me, I might as well show you. It's kind of stands out with a small pen to have such a large nib. But again, this is the Sheaffer's Lifetime nib. It was marked on the nib, Lifetime. So there was no mistaking if you had a lifetime nib. Again, the pen should have that indication on the cap with the white dot, but the nib as well would indicate being lifetime. This pen here and this pen next to it, they're slightly different. This one has a little bit of an extender, some people call a telephone dialer, but for all intents and purposes, this is the standard size of the pen, and this is the slender size. It's very minute, the difference between the two, but it exists. To show you again, those are 2 sizes: petite, slender, standard. And now I will show you some of the celluloid here, just as I continue the sizes. This is a standard size in diameter, but it's short. So that was another option that you might encounter. You could also encounter a short pen in a slender size. So you could have a slender pen in the long size, slender in the short. You could have a standard pen in the long size, standard in the short. I do not have with me a pen that they called the oversized. That was the 5th and largest size of the pen that Sheaffer made in the Balance line. You can see here another iteration of the clip between the bent clip with the prominent ball on the end and the streamlined clip with no name and a flattened ball. In between, we still have a little bend, or a little hump as collectors call it, and we still have the name on this clip. So these are really splitting hair nuances, which collectors do enjoy doing. If you're a modern user, I'm simply giving you the information so that if you're picking up a pen, you have a little more information about what you're getting and the time frame that you're getting it. Looking at the celluloid, early celluloid pens had sort of marbling patterns to them. Here is a gray marbling with some red veins. This was a green marbling with black. You could also find the pen blue with some black and white veining. You could also find the pen in a cream and black marbling pattern. I don't know if I'm forgetting any others there in the early. And then they went into a striped celluloid pattern, which was also quite lovely as they changed a little bit their plastics and they went into later production. So here we have a striped celluloid pen. They made these in green, brown, gray, carmine red, which I do not have in front of me, rose glow, which this one is here. It's a little more of a pale pinkish red. And the green changed from being marbled green to here this striped green. And here's the final iteration of the clip that you would find. In the 40s, of course, 1941-42, the US entered World War II, and military required that pins sat low in the pocket. The pin should not protrude when the pocket was buttoned, and so Sheaffer designed this clip here for those pins to sit low in the pocket, and oftentimes collectors will call this the military clip that Sheaffers use on their pins. Taking a closer look here, this pen has no dot. As you could see, neither did that one. This one has a dot. Again, it's underneath. This one had no dot. So we explored this black one first. It had the number 3 nib, as I explained. This is not a nib size anymore at this stage of the game. This is simply the name or qualification of the nib. This pin here had what Sheaffers considered an upgraded nib, which was called the Feather Touch nib. They used a palladium masking on the nib to give a little more flow to the ink and definitely a smoother writing option they advertised. And then you can find Sheaffer's lifetime nibs, as I showed you with the early Petite, that have no masking on them, or later lifetime nibs did wind up having a two-tone appearance with that palladium masking on it. So here's a lifetime nib. They can look similar to the uninitiated to the Feather Touch nibs, but again, this one is marked on the nib lifetime, while the Feather Touch is marked on the nib Feather Touch. Some little nuances here. Every now and then you'll encounter a Sheaffer's Balance that has a white feed. I don't know a whole lot about that other than it does exist, and it's not a flaw. It was something Sheaffer's did. It doesn't stay very clean when you use the pen, of course. But nevertheless, if you find a Sheaffer's Balance with a white feed, never fear, nothing is amiss. That's a feed that existed in those pens. This section on this pen is slightly loose, so I'm going to go ahead and wiggle it out. There's not a lot to show, as I've mentioned before, in these pens. They're basic lever filling pens. Sheaffer's was the first company to develop the lever filling mechanism, and it was a spring-loaded mechanism. So it could be lifted, and it could stand prominent at a 90-degree angle, but then it would snap back, as you can hear and see there, rather quickly, because that's how this mechanism worked. Very similar if you saw the video on the Esterbrook, although a little bit different in terms of how it's internally in the pen, and I'm not going to pull the lever bar because you've seen how that works in other videos. This, of course, is the section and the feed and the nib, which come out from the barrel. The sack would be attached to this portion here and be internalized, and then when you move that lever up and down, the sack will be compressed, and then once released, the sack will fill with ink. So very usable. Lever filling pens are great mechanisms. They're very reliable mechanisms, and there's no reason not to use a lever filling pen. It's something I would encourage any modern user to grab a hold of and dive right in and get comfortable with, because there's really nothing to be afraid of. One caveat here, I'll just let you know, as I do in my pens, when you're looking at vintage pens, and people sometimes say, oh, vintage pens, be careful, they can break, blah, blah, blah. If you handle a pen well and you know what you have in your hand, the likelihood of you doing damage is very minimal. As I've said before, if you have a vintage fountain pen, you're not sure if it's been restored, pulling a lever on an unrestored fountain pen is very risky, as a hardened sac inside can cause damage. Now, on the very early balances, if you wind up having an early balance, they did something called pinning the levers in place. And I'm not sure how easy it would be to see the holes there kind of right by the lever. But on the early Sheaffer's balances, the lever was held in place by a pin that went through the celluloid barrel, rather than later on being held in place by an internal C-spring clip mechanism. And so if you were to pull up on a pin like this that hadn't been restored, there is a risk of fracture here where that pin goes through if the hardened sac resists you moving the lever and you force it. So again, as always, if you're buying a pen, I would say make sure it has been restored, make sure it has been fully serviced. These vintage pens, once serviced, can last many years. And there are many reputable people who can service them. You can even learn to service them yourself if you feel so inclined and go that far down the rabbit hole. But if you don't know if it's been serviced, always ask. Don't pull a lever, because there is always risk. And this is where people get sort of into fear-mongering. I wouldn't say it's fear-mongering, it's lack of information, lack of knowledge. So knowledge is power. Know what you have, know what to be aware of, and you'll be well on your way. One final pin before we write with a balance. At the end of the line, Sheaffer's transitioned into something called the Triumph series, and this pen is sort of in a transitional nature, but you can see here the white dot, because it had a metal cap and they hadn't figured out how to put a white dot on the cap. We have one here instead, right above the lever. By this point, in 1942, 1943, Sheaffer's transitioned into making something called the Triumph. And the Triumph pens, some of them can look very similar because, again, they have the striped celluloid. And so this one here, I couldn't say for certain if it qualifies as a balance, but I believe this is an early Triumph, technically, fountain pen with a nice crest metal cap. And again, this is in a slightly shorter, slimmer size. So let's write with a Sheaffer's balance, because after all, that's what we're here to do. We're here to learn, we're here to explore, and after all, we're here to enjoy the writing experience, because the idea is that the modern user uses a vintage pen. So here we go. As always, nice paper, lovely pen, bottle of ink. I'll say it in every video, please choose good, safe inks for your vintage pens. I would advise using good, safe inks in any pen. Pen hygiene aside, the ink you put in the pen does make a difference. And so I always say a nice alkaline and pH neutral pen. Alkaline and acid are to be avoided. Go with those pH neutrals. I use Watermans. You don't have to use Watermans, but just know the ink that you're using and know that it's safe. So here we go. I've lifted the lever, snapping it back in place. You can give it a little bit of time, but those ink sacs are quite pliable, and it does not take long for the ink sac to fill with ink once you've snapped the lever back into place. Placing the cap back on the ink well to avoid any risk. I say that often as well, because if you've ever tipped over a bottle of ink, and if you've done any amount of fountain pen hobbying, especially using and writing, you maybe have, and you know what you don't want on your hands or in your lap or all over your desk is ink. Ink goes in the pen, and then it goes on the paper. So here we go, writing with a Sheaffer's balance from the 1930s. Sheaffer's. This pen has a feather touch nib in it, and it's a delightful nib to write with. Sheaffer's really put a lot of energy and effort into their nibs, and it's hard to beat the smoothness and the quality. It's unlikely in the balance era that you will find a flexible nib. Again, that did have a little bit to do with having lifetime guarantees, but as a result, Sheaffer's really made sure that the nibs that they had, although firm, were very, very smooth and very pleasurable to write with. So here you can see it writes well. And as you know, I'm an overwriter, but it's not a problem because the pen writes under its own weight. And so if you let the pen do the work, you really don't have to worry too much, even about how you hold the pen. Under its own and I gotta tell you, if you haven't used one of these, you are really missing out. This pen is quite smooth and quite a delight to use. Probably we're looking at a fine nib here on this pen. Sheaffer's did make a variety of options for the nibs: extra fine, needle point, fine, medium, broad, double broad. Even some stubs could be found. Finding the broader and stub nibs is less likely, but worth looking for if that's a pen that you like in these vintage pens. It's worth seeking out a nib in a vintage pen that you want to use and that you will enjoy. But I think you will find that even if you use the most basic nibs, that they are such a delight. So here we have the Sheaffer's Balance from the 1930s prominently, with some lovely celluloid options that you could have. Rose glow, some marbled colors, browns, large, small, and everything in between. So as a vintage pen for the modern user, it's hard to beat something as well made and as smooth writing, I've got to say, as the Sheaffer's Balance. So I hope you'll pick one up and consider adding it to your everyday use